Hi, Mark Gilbert here. Thanks for clicking in. For the next few minutes, we're going to be talking about the meaning of wholeness. And like all our videos here, they're designed to give you tools and ideas to assist with our spiritual evolution. I hope you find it useful, and if so, I'd love it if you'd hit that subscribe button. It lets YouTube know you like the videos we're making here. So when we talk about the meaning of wholeness, there's some part of you that says, well, gee, that's self-evident. We know what the word wholeness means. I mean, we can look at it the fact that I'm holding an apple pie and somebody took a piece out of it, so it's no longer whole. There's a piece missing. Or we can look at it that we're building a car and we haven't put the battery in, but everything else is there. And as soon as we connect the battery, then there's a degree of wholeness that we have completed the car. Or we could think of it as a jigsaw puzzle, for example, and we're putting all the pieces out on the table. And when we get all the pieces put together, then we have created a state of wholeness within that puzzle. So we all know what the word wholeness means and when something is whole and when it's not whole. But what we're really talking about in this video is a degree of human wholeness. And what do we mean by human wholeness? So when we talk about wholeness from the state of these spiritual beings moving through this human experience, it's obviously a much more complex topic than the wholeness of a pie or a car or a jigsaw puzzle. But there are some commonalities that we can find by looking at the puzzle, for example, and saying, well, if a puzzle is missing some pieces, what does that tell us about our individual lives? How can we go about reviewing our life and feeling where maybe there's some pieces missing, some pieces that if we're able to plug them in, we'll have a greater sense of wholeness? How can we go about doing that? Well, one thing we can do is to take our life and divide it up into areas and say, well, from a standpoint of our physical nature or our emotional nature, or our social relationship nature, or our psychological mind nature, or our spiritual nature, is there something lacking? You know, we can review each area of our life and say, am I whole and complete in this nature? Take, for example, your physical self. Are there areas where you're getting the right diet, the right exercise? Are you struggling with any kind of health issue? As you do a self-analysis on your physical form, you can find that perhaps there are areas where there is a lack of wholeness in your life and a desire for a certain degree of wellness and healthy physical state. So we can identify some areas there where we're lacking wholeness. Similarly, we can look at other areas of our life. We can look at it from a standpoint of our social lives and say, are we missing anything in terms of the relationships? Do we have our relationships unhealthy or healthy? Are there lacking relationships in our lives? Do we lack friends or a key romantic relationship? Is there some area where we're not whole based on our interrelationship with other human beings? We can also look at our emotional standpoint and say, are there areas where I am unhappy or struggling emotionally? Or are there areas where I have buried emotions out of fear of looking at the particular issue that's underlying it? I think as we do a self-analysis of our emotions, we can find where there are shadow aspects of our nature, perhaps, that we've buried, that we need to shine a light on if we're going to truly move to a state of wholeness. In psychology, they like to reference wholeness as being a bringing into alignment the state of conscious awareness and our subconscious, similar to the shadow stuff that I was just mentioning. But if we have aspects of ourselves that are driving our psychological state and they're hidden to us, then we need to bring them into the light of day so we can examine them. So in each area that we can parse our life down, we can look at that individual aspect of our lives and say, is there an area here where we are not experiencing wholeness and that we can move to a greater sense of wholeness by addressing that particular issue? You know, that's very much is in alignment with the work of Ken Wilber and the integral theorist, which I've got a great value from over the years. They actually bring about a practices, integral practices that are all designed to bring a state of integral wholeness into our lives. the whole area of integral, which I've done some videos on, is about looking at all of your areas of your life. That is the inner awareness, the outer expressions, you as an individual and you collectively with all of humanity, as well as all of our multiple intelligences and our states of consciousness and so forth, that we look at all areas of our life to bring them into a degree of where do we need to develop and become whole in each of those areas, and then integrating them better. So the whole nature of integral theory is a personal development state that brings us into an integral nature with all of our development, i.e. it brings us into a state of wholeness. I've mentioned in another video the integral practices, which is a desire to take our life, and there's a video on the title that gets into that, but to take our life and to go and to look into multiple areas of our life where perhaps we need to do some developmental work. And by doing that, it brings us into a greater sense of wholeness. You know, integral theory reminds us that we should look at our life from a standpoint of our body, our mind, our heart, and our spirit. That we should also look at our relationship to the good, the true, and the beautiful. Now, a lot could be said about all of those, but if we can bring all of those together into our focus and find where we are not bringing them together in our lives, then that gives us a clue for perhaps where we might find a greater degree of wholeness in this personal experience that we're going through. Another thing that I like from the work of Ken Wilber is he references that our development as a spiritual being goes through basically 4 areas, that we are here to grow up, and by that he means developmentally move through our various intelligences to a higher state of becoming in each one of those. And so if we could take our sense of our emotional intelligence, our cognitive intelligence, our kinesthetic intelligence, all of the multiple intelligences that we have, and develop each one of those to the highest degree possible as this particular human being, then in a degree we are growing up in each one of those. But he also talks about the fact that we need to wake up, and by wake up he means that we need to use spiritual practices like meditation and other techniques that allow us to taste into the ground of all being, the divine flow, God, spirit, whatever name you want to give it. But the very nature that we can touch into that spiritual essence that connects the universe is a state of us actually waking up. He then calls us to show up, and by showing up he means to be in service to the greater good, to recognize that we have talents and abilities that are called to be expressed in this lifetime, and that's important. And then the 4th state of development that he calls us to do is cleaning up, and that's the same as the shadow work that I was referencing earlier, where we take those aspects of ourselves that we've buried and have practices that bring those buried aspects into the light of day so that we can address them consciously. So that those 4 states, those 4 developmental areas of waking up, showing up, cleaning up, and growing up, if we can bring all of those developmentally forward, then we are coming towards a greater sense of wholeness as a human being. One of the key takeaways of this video that I hope you're getting is that as human beings, when we're looking at the issue of wholeness, that we can take our wholeness and break it into categories and look at those individual categories to determine where perhaps we have areas for growth towards wholeness in that area. But at the end of the day, we've got to take all these areas that we've divided, i.e. our physical bodies, our emotional bodies, our social lives, our psychological lives, our spiritual lives, bring them all back together and integrate them into a whole. That's what I think the work of the integral theorists do quite well, and something I encourage all of us to do. If we're truly moving towards a state of wholeness in this human experience, then we need to examine our lives, determine where we need to develop areas to wholeness in that area, but to reintegrate everything. It's only in that reintegration that we become moving into that state of really recognizing our sense of wholeness. You know, other areas that we can consider in terms of wholeness are those areas of our lives where we are in circulation. And we can think of it in terms of, are we giving and are we receiving? because we can block the flow and the wholeness if we're only doing one or we're out of balance. So giving and receiving are two sides of the same coin, just as are loving and accepting love, or listening to others and expressing ourselves. If we get out of balance in any of these areas of our life, then we can be missing out on a degree of wholeness there as well. When I talk about wholeness, I'd be remiss if I didn't quote one of my favorite writers. It's author Parker Palmer, who wrote this book, A Hidden Wholeness. I've had the benefit of interviewing Parker a couple of times in different roles I've had in my life, and he's a wonderful human being, and I highly recommend this book. But I'd like to share just a couple of thoughts from the book, A Hidden Wholeness. Now, in his book, Parker writes about what he calls human experiences frequently leading us into a state of what he calls the divided life. The divided life is, in a sense, a state of non-wholeness. What are the characteristics of a divided life? Let me read just a few of these to you. He says that it's situations where we refuse to invest ourselves in our work, diminishing its quality and distancing ourselves from those it's meant to serve. That we make our living at jobs that violate our basic values even when survival doesn't absolutely demand it. That we remain in settings or relationships that steadily kill off our spirits. That we harbor secrets to achieve personal gain at the expense of other people. That we hide our beliefs from those who disagree with us to avoid conflict, challenge, and change. And that we conceal our true identities for fear of being criticized, shunned, or attacked. How is it that we come to experience a divided life? Well, Parker writes that we arrive in this world undivided, integral, whole. But sooner or later, we erect a wall between our inner and outer lives, trying to protect what is within us or to deceive the people around us. Only when the pain of our dividedness becomes more than we can bear do most of us embark on an inner journey toward living divided no more. Parker then goes on to describe some stages that we move through from the state of divided life back into a state of wholeness. It reads much like the hero's journey, that state of beginning where everything is complete and whole and perfect, yet we move out into life because we don't recognize the perfection that we already have, move through experiences that are less than what we want, and then return home again and know the home as we've never known it before. Much like in the lines of T.S. Eliot in that famous poem where he wrote, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." That's much the life that all of us are moving on, that we are all born from a state of wholeness, yet we must move through this state of form and this experience of less than wholeness to return to the state of wholeness from which we sprang at the beginning. Or as Parker writes, he says, all of the great spiritual traditions want to awaken us to the fact that we co-create the reality in which we live. And all of them ask two questions intended to help us keep us awake. What are we sending from within ourselves out into the world, and what impact is it having out there? What is the world sending back at us, and what impact is it having in here? We are continually engaged in the evolution of self and world, and we have the power to choose, moment by moment, between that which gives life and that which gives death. In his book, Parker calls us to move through the process that leads us back into a sense of wholeness in our lives. Ultimately, whether we're looking at it through the integral lens and parsing our life into sections, figuring out where we're lacking and then moving to self-correct and then integrate them all back together again, or whether we move through the stages as Parker describes in his book, ultimately what we're all doing when we're moving to wholeness and what wholeness actually represents is to recognize that we are spiritual beings at our essence, and that those spiritual beings are perfect, whole, and complete in and of themselves. But that we're also moving through and becoming in this world of form. And in that world of form and this humanness, we can experience lack and limitation and separation. But ultimately, we move through those to come back into and recognize our spiritual truth. We're all on the hero's journey, and the journey is always a journey back into wholeness. So what are you doing to move into wholeness in your life? How are you experiencing it? I would love your feedback. Be sure to leave me a comment down below the video. If you've got ideas for other topics you'd like me to address in other videos, be sure to drop me an email. Email address is on the screen right now. Thanks for listening. Until next time. Hey, one more quick thing. I'd love it if you subscribe to the channel. The link is down there on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Also, there's a related video you might want to watch. It's right next to my face. And if you like this video, be sure to click like and leave me a comment on YouTube. Thanks.